that should be it. And okay, there's a delay. All right, so it looks like we are on. So, all right. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to spotlight you, Pete.
Should I try to put my screen on?
Yeah, let's go ahead and test that first. I wanted to introduce you before we begin, though.
Okay, how's that? Does that look right?
Yeah,
Okay, you got my screen?
definitely.
Perfect.
Gotcha. All right. So, I just have a few things to say before we get started. I'm going to pull up my notes because I want to make sure that you have done so much, Pete, that I want to make sure that I get all the things accurately listed here. But we really do begin our museum events and many CWU events with a land acknowledgement, and so I do want to begin that way as well. Central Washington University acknowledges the people who have been on this land since time immemorial. The Ellensburg campus is on land ceded by the Peshawanampum and other bands and tribes of the Yakima Nation in the Treaty of 1855. The Yakima people remain committed stewards of this land, cherishing it and protecting it as instructed by elders through generations. We are honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands and give thanks to the legacy of the original people, their lives, and their descendants. As I am sure you all recognize, land acknowledgements are only a beginning. We must couple these statements with commitments and actions. At the CWU Museum of Culture and Environment, we are committed to collaborative work with Native American communities, with a special attention to those communities upon whose land we reside upon, and those communities whose material culture we steward. We acknowledge that this museum would not exist without exploitative legacies of colonialism that have resulted in collecting, displaying, and appropriating the material culture and traditional knowledge of peoples around the globe. The CWU Museum is working to foster new kinds of relationships with Native American communities, whether that entails repatriation, co-created exhibits and programs, or the implementation of traditional care practices. And we invite each and every one of you to keep holding us as museum practitioners accountable to this work as we work towards a more equitable future. So I want to take a little bit of time now to welcome Dr. Peter Ungar. So what can I say about Dr. Peter Ungar? So to begin, I want to note that Dr. Ungar was actually a member of my master's thesis committee. I don't know if you remember this. When I was in grad school at the University of Arkansas, where he generously read an entire thesis that I had written at the age of 25, which I don't remember any of at this point. And he signed off on it. Who knew? All the way back in 2005. So thanks for that. But more importantly, I mostly knew Dr. Ungar through his students, who were my peers in graduate school. I knew Dr. Ungar as a beloved professor who had a knack for making difficult concepts relatable. And this was really evident when I, along with our museum studies students, began research for the exhibit Tooth and Tusk, Evolutionary Storytellers. I knew that Dr. Ungar was obsessed with teeth. I'd heard that through his students and through my professors, his colleagues, but I didn't know exactly how obsessed with teeth Dr. Ungar was until we began reading his book, Mammal Teeth. And so we learned that you can learn a lot about mammals by looking at their teeth, and our colleague here at CWU in biology, Dr. Chris Ernst, would say to us, mammals are teeth. But the information that teeth can provide can be really complex, and the shapes of different teeth, particularly molars, they vary according to the kinds of food and by extension environments that mammals encounter and eat. And so Dr. Ungar's books were really helpful because they made this topic both approachable and interesting, especially for those of us who are approaching these ideas for the first time. At the University of Arkansas, Dr. Ungar is the Distinguished Professor and Director of the Environmental Dynamics Program. Much of his research is on the role of diets in shaping who we are as humans. One of our student curators, Kevin Menzia, was able to read Dr. Ungar's book, Evolution's Bite, and used it as a framework for developing a section of Tooth and Tusk that features casts of our hominin ancestors. As an anthropologist, Dr. Ungar's work spans the gamut of biological anthropology, from observation of wild apes to the study of fossil hominins to the oral health of contemporary hunter-gatherer communities. And his work appears in popular science venues such as the journals Nature and Science, but he has also published 3 books, 2 of which I've already mentioned. A few months ago, I was pleased to open up an email from the University of Arkansas Alumni Association that recognized Dr. Ungar's appointment to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So that was pretty cool. So full disclosure, as a cultural anthropologist, I never got to take a class with Dr. Ungar, but working on this exhibit has made me wish that I had. So I hope everyone joins me in welcoming Dr. Peter Ungar. Yay!
Thank you, Hope. And you said you could see the background slide? Awesome, perfect. Well, thanks again for the kind invitation for me to speak with you all today. And the topic of my presentation is following on your exhibit, teeth. More specifically, dental evidence for the diets of our distant ancestors. And if you see me looking off to your left, my right, it's because my screen is being projected on another monitor, so please forgive me. Teeth, right? There's something about them. You know, we're drawn to them. When we see them in natural history museums or picture books, our reaction is visceral. For whatever reason, they're important to us. Maybe it's got something to do with the fact that we spent most of our evolutionary history running away from them. But again, for whatever reason, they're important to us. And just how important? Well, in an online dating site survey, Match.com, thousands of singles were polled and asked what the most important asset is on a prospective date. And for both men and women, teeth came in to be the #1 most important asset. Now, that's pretty remarkable in and of itself. But if you want to talk about how remarkable teeth are, just think of the feat of engineering. Your teeth have to break without themselves being broken up to millions of times over the course of your lifetime. And they have to do it built from the very same raw materials as the foods that you're eating. So teeth can just show us what an incredibly inspired engineer nature can be. I'm interested in teeth, though, because of what it can teach us about evolution. Just think of the many myriad types of mammalian molars. You've got this antelope down here with flat teeth, with long parallel ridges of enamel, well designed for grinding down tough grasses. You've got this group of teeth in the middle here of a lion. Those are called carnassials. They're blades that are perfectly suited for shearing and slicing through animal meat and sinew and things of that nature. And then you've got these flat, blunt, thickly enameled teeth of the hyena at the top, perfectly designed in this case for crushing hard foods like bone. So teeth can tell us not just about diet, but they can literally tell us something about the place of an animal in nature. What can the teeth of our ancestors teach us? What can they teach us about our place in nature? That's sort of the question that I'm most interested in, and the subject of today's presentation. I'll start with a brief consideration of how teeth work, that is, how tooth shape relates to diet, and then move on to how teeth are used, which is not the same question. We'll take an ecological approach. I'll then introduce the concept of food prints, particularly looking at teeth using microscopic tooth wear. Then assemble the evidence for the diets of our early ancestors, considering their teeth. And finally, we'll take a look and see whether there are any lessons to be learned from today or for today. All right, well, the story really begins with teeth as guides for chewing. Karen Heamy said it best in the 1970s. She was a British paleontologist. She argued that teeth are an essentially passive element in the active masticatory apparatus. They're dependent on the movements of the mandible, the jaw, for their functional interactions. In other words, Teeth are basically passive players in the active game of chewing. If you've got flat teeth, like this sheep tooth here, with long parallel ridges of enamel, you want to move sort of horizontal to the plane of chewing for grinding down tough grasses. Same if you are a rodent and you've got flat teeth with long parallel ridges of enamel, perpendicular to that line of movement. Think of one of these old-fashioned washboards with the parallel grooves and ridges, and the way that you move the clothes perpendicular to those ridges. That's sort of the action that you're looking at. You can also have the teeth of a lion, right? These long shearing blades. In this case, movement is vertical. Think of a pair of scissors for shearing or slicing. Or you can have the teeth of a human being, or for that matter, a bear or a pig. We've got sort of these cusps that fit neatly into basins. Vertical movements again, in this case for crushing and grinding. Think of a mortar and a pestle. But there's another view of teeth. Teeth can be considered tools for fracture. Another British paleontologist, Peter Lucas, said it best: we can best explain dental dietary adaptations by identifying different forms of food, generalizing about their behaviors under stress, and designing equipment that might operate efficiently to comminute or break them down. In other words, think of it as an engineering problem, where you start with food and figure out what the best tools would be to break down that food. When you start with foods really don't want to be eaten, generally speaking. And they protect themselves by changing the properties of their structures. Some foods harden their tissues, make it difficult to start a crack in them. Think of a walnut, right? A sheet of glass or a rock is hard. It doesn't take a lot of work to spread that crack once it starts, but it takes a lot of work to start the crack. So it's hard and brittle. Other foods protect themselves by toughening their structures. This is the work it takes not to start a crack, but to spread it. It might be easy to start a crack through a tough food item. It might be soft. But to spread that crack's another story. Think of leather, think of raw meat. So the challenge the teeth face in breaking these different types of foods is that in order to break something, you need to start and spread a crack. And in order to do that, you've got to pull an item apart. When you push an item together, that doesn't spread a crack, it stops a crack from spreading. The challenge that teeth face is that they work by compression. Your lower teeth push up into your upper ones. But tension is required to start and spread cracks. So you've got to basically create tension from compression. How to do that? Well, if you're looking at something like a walnut, something that is hard, you can crush it, and the hard shell will flex in the plane perpendicular to the axis of crushing, and that creates tension. And the best tool in this case is going to be like a hemispherical dome, because it limits the point of contact. Stress is force per unit area. So in other words, if you're pounding a nail into a wall, it's a lot easier to pound a nail than to pound, say, a hammer, because there's a smaller contact area. But it also protects the tooth itself by having this sort of dome shape. It won't break. If you're looking at a tough food item, again, tough foods are foods where it requires work to spread a crack. A wedge works better. Think of an axe splitting a log. The wedge creates tension at the point of the advancing tip, and that spreads a crack. In this case, the best tool would be a blade. So how does this actually translate to real teeth? We've got 3 monkey species here. And if you look at their molar teeth, they all look pretty similar, in fact. At the bottom, we've got a leaf-eating monkey. At the top, we have a nut-feeding monkey. And in the middle, we've got a soft fruit-eating monkey. So a mangabey, a macaque, and a langur. So as it turns out, you can see evidence for these differences in diet, though, by looking at the teeth. The leaf monkey has the longest shearing blades. The hard object feeding monkey has the shortest shearing blades. And this corresponds to what you would expect given the properties of the foods that they usually eat. How do we typically measure this? Well, the easiest thing to do is to just measure the lengths of the crests running front to back on each tooth relative to the length of the tooth itself. The relatively longer the crests, the more the shear potential. And if we can plot out the summed crest length, the lengths of these crests over the molar length for a variety of different animals that are closely related but have one kind of diet, in this case, it might be a fruit-eating old world monkey. Well, in that case, we get a regression line that pretty much tells you what the expected crest lengths are for a fruit-eating monkey with a given molar length. That's pretty cool, but what's even cooler is when you put a bunch of monkeys with different diets on top of the same graph. These are leaf eaters in green. And as you can see, leaf eaters have longer shearing crests for a given molar length than is expected. We can use this. We can use this to say something about diet from teeth. If we take fossils, put them on the same plot, we can tell, even by one tooth, whether an animal has evolved to eat leaves or fruits. But there are some issues here. First, you can't just measure the lengths of crests on teeth that are worn, right? The landmarks that you use to measure these crests move and in fact disappear over time. That makes it really difficult to use this approach. And second, teeth are really complex three-dimensional structures. And depending upon this, there's got to be more to the structure of a tooth than simply the crest length. Should be able to tell you something more about diet than just that. And so in my lab, we developed something called dental topographic analysis to address these challenges. Dental topographic analysis is based on something called geographic information systems, or GIS. GIS is just sort of a suite of computer programs that allow you to relate information that's connected geographically in space. So for example, let's say you're a farmer and you're trying to figure out where to plant your crops. Maybe you'll take a map of soil types and a map of precipitation or water flow, and then superimpose on top of those maps a map of land relief or topography. And then you can just look for the best combination of attributes to figure out where to plant your crops. One thing GIS is really good at is mapping landscapes. And I figured I could get a laser scanner, scan teeth, and plot those teeth as landscapes, right? The cusps become mountains, the fissures become valleys. And we can use all the tools available in GIS to characterize tooth shape without having to worry about landmarks that move. So for example, we can look at the average surface slope, the angularity or jaggedness of the surface. We can look at the relief or the ratio between the 3D surface area and the projected 2D area of a tooth and say something about diet. And since we developed these first tools, others have come along and come up with other ones that are equally interesting and a little bit more elaborate. Orientation patch count is the number of patches of tooth surface that are contiguous that have a given orientation. Dirichlet normal energy is a measure of the curvature of the surface of the tooth. These should all be able to tell us something about diet. So here's a quick example from really early in my research. We've got the average surface slope and the average relief of gorillas in green, orangutans in orange, chimpanzees in red. Gorillas eat more leaves, chimps more fruits, orangutans a mix of fruits and leaves. I've also plotted them on the basis of how worn they are. Unworn, stage 1, moderately worn, stage 2, heavily worn, stage 3. And it turns out that there are 3 bits of information that we take out of this. First, teeth get flatter as they wear for a given species. That makes sense. Second, at a given wear stage, leaf eaters have longer or have more sloping surfaces and more relief than fruit eaters, and the mixed feeding orangutans are in the middle. And third, this relationship between diet and tooth form holds regardless of what wear stage you're looking at. So if you can control for wear, you can say something about diet and fossils. Now, I became really interested in how tooth wear relates to diet. And so I sort of collaborated with some colleagues at Johns Hopkins and Duke, and we went down to Costa Rica year after year. They went for a total of about 10 years and repeatedly darted the same monkeys over and over again, taking impressions of their teeth and making casts of those impressions. So we were actually able to look in wild animals at how tooth wear progresses. And when we did that, we found that, as you would expect, the more years between observations, the greater the change in the slope of the surface. Again, teeth get flatter as they wear. Same for relief, but for the jaggedness of the surface of the tooth, angularity, that seemed to hold pretty well. So here was an attribute that was independent of how worn the tooth was that could help us with diet. More recently, my students and I in 2018 did a study of hundreds of New World monkeys, all from one small area in Brazil, Para State, along a single river. And basically there were about a dozen species, including squirrel monkeys, like this fruit-eating squirrel monkey, gum gouging marmosets, leaf-eating howling monkeys, hard object feeding capuchins. And then we plotted out the dental topography traits and saw that, well, there are some nice patterns relating diet to tooth form. In this case, orientation, patch count, and angularity, both pretty good, pretty sensitive to tooth wear. And we find that leaf eaters, gum feeders, seed predators are all clearly separated. But interestingly, fruit eaters sort of run the gambit. And if we isolate the fruit eaters, though, we get another really interesting story. These are just the fruit eaters, and this is their secondary diets, what they eat when fruits aren't available. Clear separation between hard object feeders, seed predators, leaf eaters, and insect feeders. So clearly, tooth shape can tell us something about diet. But is it really this simple? It turns out that relationships between anatomy and behavior are complex, and they depend on the situation. Biological structures are often overbuilt for day-to-day functioning. And the analogy that I like to give is this one here. Your car may be capable of going 100 miles an hour. That doesn't mean you're going to be driving that way in the big city during rush hour. Most of the time, you're not going to take advantage of that horsepower, but it will be helpful those few times you have to accelerate to get on the highway. Looked at another way, your teeth, you may eat Jell-O 360 days a year. It doesn't matter what your teeth look like. But if you've got to eat rocks 5 days a year or you're going to starve, your teeth had better be designed for eating rocks. So let's go into the wild and take a quick look and see how teeth are actually used in light of our understanding of how they work. The default model is called the species-specific dietary adaptations model, and it makes a lot of sense. Basic idea behind it is that primates are going to eat specific food types even when they live in different habitats, because the shapes of their teeth and the anatomy of their guts tells them that that's what they should eat. So if you are a ring-tailed lemur or a howling monkey or a vervet monkey, you're going to search out and find the same types of food, even when you've got two populations in two different habitats with access to different species of plants. Why? Because that's what your guts and your teeth tell you should eat. That'd be great if it was always the case, but in the real world, it isn't. I'll give you two examples. Let's start with hard object feeding mangabey monkeys. Mangabeys have thick, flat teeth and strong jaws for crushing hard foods. And in fact, a group of mangabeys in the Thai forest of the Ivory Coast, the sooty mangabeys, actually prefer and eat very hard Saccharomylus nuts that they consume year-round. Saccharomylus nuts are kind of like peach pits. They're extremely hard and rot resistant, and they can be found year-round on the forest floor. None of the other primates in the Thai forest eat these because their teeth just can't handle them. This gives the sooty mangabeys an advantage. But then there are the closely related great cheek mangabeys from Kabaling in Uganda. They prefer soft, fleshy fruits that are available most of the time. In fact, this is just what their sort of wimpier toothed red-tailed monkey cousins eat. But decades of study have shown that these monkeys only eat hard foods during the extreme drought that comes with strong El Nino events. So this can be even once in a generation. These monkeys are closely related, have similar teeth and jaws, live in similar environments, but have very different food preferences. One more example. Let's look at mountain gorillas, which have these sharp, cresty molar teeth. They've got highly crested teeth for shearing and slicing tough foods like wild celery and stems and leaves and things of that nature. But like the mangabeys, they seasonally fall back on soft fruits at lower altitudes. Their anatomy allows them to eat tough leaves and stems during the period of seasonal stress when favored foods are not available. But when they are available, it doesn't matter what their teeth look like. Contrast that with higher altitude gorillas, like the ones that Diane Fossey studied in the Virunga Mountains. These poor animals have been pushed up sort of to the top, to the very tips of these mountains where there are no fruits available, where no self-respecting ape would ever want to live. But they have no choice because people have settled around the base of the volcano because it's such rich agricultural lands. In any case, these gorillas always eat lower quality tough foods, not because they want to, but because they have to and their anatomy allows them to do it. So this involves the same species, same adaptive specializations, but different diets because they live in different environments. This brings up the concept of the biospheric buffet. According to this concept, teeth may limit what can be eaten, but food choice is determined by availability in a given habitat. You see, I think of the biosphere, that part of our planet that harbors life, as a kind of giant buffet table, a Chinese buffet or Golden Corral or something. You envision animals bellying up to that sneeze guard with their plates in their hands, and they pick and choose from whatever items are available, whatever items nature has laid out at a given time and in a given place. And this explains why chimpanzees eat soft forest foods, whereas geladas that live in the open savanna consume tough grasses, not because they want to, but because that's what's available to them. The teeth are important. They're the utensils that they have to eat with, but that's not what primarily determines food choice. So given that, how can we use teeth at all to reconstruct diets in the fossil records? There's another approach to doing it, an approach I call food prints, which, like footprints in the sand, are traces of actual activities of once living organisms. And the food print that I use, dental microwear, the microscopic scratches and pits that form on the tooth surface as a result of its use. So a hard object feeding capuchin monkey will have pits on its teeth as its lower teeth pound up into the uppers to crush nuts. Whereas this howling monkey down here, a leaf eater, will have scratches on its teeth because its teeth slide past one another like scissor blades when they shear and slice through tough leaves. The abrasives on those leaves getting dragged along the surface as the blades open and close. And how do we measure microwear? The traditional approach is we use a scanning electron microscope, and then we go in and we count, measure every single scratch and pit, and this one has, I counted 456 on this one. And it's a lot of work. It explains why I have these god-awful reading glasses at my age. But that said, it can tell you something about diet. This graph shows a ratio of pits to scratches on teeth. Higher values, more pits, lower values, more scratches. And each of these bars is a different species. In yellow, hard object feeders. In green, tough leaf eaters. In red, soft fruit eaters. And you can see that pretty much as expected, microwear separates primates by diet. You should just be able to put a fossil species on this graph and see what it ate. But just like shearing crest analyses have their limitations, so too does conventional microwear. First of all, when you take a three-dimensional surface and reduce it to 2 dimensions, like an SEM photograph, you lose information. The information you lose depends upon your settings on the instrument. So just think of taking a photograph of a surface with the light cast at different orientations. You'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So as you rotate the specimen on the stage, you can go from a heavily scratched surface to a more pitted surface back to a heavily scratched surface just by changing the settings. Likewise, measurements aren't very repeatable. With hundreds of features on a surface, no one can get the same measurements twice, let alone two different observers. So there's error in the measurement. These things create a problem. And to solve that problem, again in my lab, we developed a new technique, one that we call dental microwear texture analysis. It starts with an instrument called a confocal profiler that generates a high-resolution 3D rendering of a surface. In this case, this is about 1/10 of a millimeter. And then we use something called scale-sensitive fractal analysis, which is sort of an engineering standard for measuring textures, to try and figure out sort of what the texture of the surface looks like, or at least to give numbers to characterize it. Now, scale-sensitive fractal analysis is based on the notion that surface texture depends on your scale of observation. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, think of driving along a backcountry road in central Washington. And then think of being an ant crossing that road. Seems much smoother to you in the car than to the ant on the ground. And how texture changes with scale is what's important for microwear. We measure it by laying triangles on top of a microwear surface. Big triangles, low scale, small triangles, high scale. And as the smaller triangles get into the nooks and crannies, that gives you more area. And how area changes with scale is the steepest part of the slope, what we define as complexity. So for example, this surface over here, which has a lot of pits on it, that is a complex surface. Whereas this one with these scratches, that's a much simpler surface because it's much more uniform. There are lots of other attributes we can look at. One, for example, is anisotropy or anisotropy. And without going into details on how that's measured, basically it's a measurement of how oriented a surface is. Lots of scratches running the same way, highly anisotropic. Lots of pits or scratches running in random directions, isotropic. And so a leaf eater should have simple anisotropic surfaces. A nut eater should have complex isotropic surfaces. And that holds whether you're looking at leaf-eating howling monkeys or nut-eating capuchins, grass blade-eating geladas on the savanna, or our hard object specialists from the Thai forests, the mangabees. It even holds when we look at other animals. Like here is a tough meat-eating cheetah versus a bone-crunching hyena, a tough bamboo-feeding panda versus a more omnivorous black bear, a tough grass-eating kangaroo versus a more browserly eating stems and fruits and leaves wallaby. It even holds for things that don't even have tooth enamel, like this leaf-eating sloth versus this more omnivorous armadillo. But the best example, in my opinion, is this one, antelopes. Antelopes range on the spectrum from those that eat nothing but grass to those that eat nothing but browse, including fruits. These are data from an old PhD student of mine, Jessica Scott. Brilliant piece of work. We've got anisotropy on the y-axis, that is whether the surfaces are directional, and complexity, or how pitted it is, on the x-axis. Look at that separation. Up here, we've got 100% grass, 30% grass, 60% grass, 80% grass, 100%, 100% grass, 80% grass, 60% grass, 40% grass, no grass over here. So decreasing grass, increasing browse. And the separation is beautiful. And this is kind of cool because we actually use this to reconstruct the environments that our ancestors lived in. All we have to do is find antelopes from the same fossil deposits as our ancestors, look at their teeth and see whether they were grazers or browsers. Remember the biospheric buffet, right? Animals eat what's available to them. Grass eaters live in grasslands. Browsers, particularly fruit eaters, live in forests. And so we can tell what the environment was by looking at the diets of the animals found alongside our ancestors. Let's get back for a moment to microwear of living primates. Our hypothesis is that a tough food specialist should have all simple surfaces, a hard object specialist should have all complex surfaces, and a hard object fallback feeder, like our mangabees from Kabali in Uganda, should have a lot of simple surfaces with fewer and fewer out towards the more complex end of the spectrum. Even though these two have the same shaped teeth, their microwear signatures should be different. And they are. This is exciting. So take a look here. We've got microwear texture complexity on the y-axis. Here are the values. Here's a graph for our leaf-eating silvery langur, our hard object specialist mangabey. Our soft fruit-eating macaque monkey is right in between the mangabey with a high texture complexity and the leaf eater with the low texture complexity. But what's even cooler is this fallback feeding mangabey with teeth like the other mangabey, but a diet like the soft fruit eater. And its microwear looks much like the soft fruit eater, although it does have these outliers up at the high end of the spectrum of complexity, which is exactly what you would expect of a fallback feeder. But what about our own ancestors? What can we learn about their diets by looking at their teeth? Well, in case you're not all that familiar with human evolution, there are literally thousands of fossils identified representing the human fossil record. And there are more than a dozen species commonly recognized. It's kind of an overwhelming amount of information. But I like to divide the human fossil record into 4 groups. The first group, what we call putative hominins, lived around the time of the split with chimpanzees. We can call these guys from about 7 to 4.5 million years ago, Ardipithecus and friends. They lived in what was then sort of the woodland forests of much of Africa, still lived in the trees. And then about 4.2 to about 2 million years ago, Australopithecus came along. It has evidence of coming down out of the trees, which makes sense because the savannas began spreading across the African continent. Then about 2.5, maybe 2.8 million years ago, there's a fork in the evolutionary road. In one direction, we get Paranthropus, which is a hard object, or I shouldn't say hard object, which is sort of a savanna specialist with big, robust faces, massive chewing muscles, very thickly enameled, massive teeth. And in the other direction, we get a variety of species of our own ancestors, Homo. Larger brains, smaller teeth, came down out of the ground, out of the trees onto the ground 100% of the time eventually, and left the African continent. So what can we say about their diets from their teeth? Well, if you look at Ardipithecus, it has fairly wimpy, fairly modest-sized teeth with some relief on them and fairly thin enamel, kind of what you'd expect of a forest fruit eater. But when you get to Australopithecus, and particularly Paranthropus, the teeth get larger. The enamel gets thicker. The teeth get flatter. It looks like there's increasing specialization. For Homo, we see a reversal of the trend. The teeth get smaller, crestier. The enamel gets thinner. And this leads us to a scenario where we start with a soft, fruit-eating, forest-living, Ardipithecus-like creature, and progressively over time, early to later Australopithecus and into Paranthropus, increasing specialization for harder or more abrasive savanna diets. Whereas Homo, with its wimpier teeth, larger brains, stone tools, and bones found alongside bones with cut marks on them, indicating butchery, suggests a broader diet, including more meat. That's the basic take-home scenario. But what does the topography and the microwear teach us? Let's go back to occlusal slope, 3 wear stages, gorillas in green, chimps in red. Where do our fossils fall? Australopithecus has even less sloping teeth than chimpanzees, suggesting a better ability to crush hard foods. Paranthropus has even flatter teeth, suggesting even more of an ability to crush hard foods. And Homo, interestingly, comes out in between chimps and gorillas. Better at hard foods than gorillas, better at tough ones than chimps. So this seems pretty well consistent with the standard scenario. But is it really this simple? Remember biospheric buffet? Remember food prints? I've done microanalysis. My students and I have done microanalysis on Australopithecus species, early Homo species, and Paranthropus species. Here, for example, is a plot of complexity. On the left, soft, tough foods indicated by low complexity. On the right, hard, brittle ones by high complexity. When we look at Australopithecus, the earlier Afarensis and slightly later Africanus, there's not a lot of evidence for hard object feeding. Maybe a little bit more in Africanus than in Afarensis, the later one, the earlier one, but not much is going on. With Paranthropus, though, it's really bizarre. These two species have very similar shaped teeth. These massive, thick molars, heavy chewing muscles, very well buttressed skulls and faces and jaws. But look at the difference. The East African form boisei looks just like its Australopithecus predecessors as a soft food eater, whereas the South African form robustus looks like it ate both soft and hard foods, probably a greater range of variation than any of the other hominin species. When we get to Homo habilis, the earliest of our Homo ancestors, had a little bit broader range of variation than its Australopithecus predecessors. And as we get to later and later Homo, you see more broader and broader spectrum of microwear signatures, which would be consistent with broader and broader diets. So to summarize this, for Homo, we start with early Australopithecus to late Australopithecus to early Homo to later Homo. We see what looks like progressively broader diet over time. But for Paranthropus, we don't see that pattern. It's true in one case with the South African Paranthropus, but the East African Paranthropus has a very narrow diet, despite the fact that these two have similar shaped skulls and teeth. You'd never know they differed in diet on the basis of their anatomy. So what can we learn from the biospheroid buffet, thinking about these tooth elements? Well, we know a lot about the biospheric buffet table over the course of human evolution in Africa, because paleoclimatologists and paleoecologists have reconstructed the climate and environments of Africa over this course of time. We can see here the fluctuations from warm and wet to cool and dry conditions over time. And in fact, there's a general trend from forested settings 7 million years ago to more open savanna today, with the cooling and drying. But there's also a trend for increasing amplitude of the fluctuations between warm and wet and cool and dry. And this increasing amplitude has been taken to explain why our Homo ancestors developed broader diets. It made them more versatile in the face of ever-changing conditions. And that's pretty much where we are today, as far as our understanding of the evolution of human diet goes. Can this help us as we move forward? Well, paleo diet books have come and gone over time. The trends have come and gone. The Google search engines which tell us the amount of searching that's done on paleo diets have risen and fallen. But these books have sold tens of millions of copies. The basic idea behind all of them is the same. Many of the chronic degenerative diseases we face today, things like, well, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, just metabolic syndrome in general, several forms of cancer have been linked to a mismatch between what we eat today and what our ancestors evolved to eat. The basic idea is that, well, you wouldn't put diesel in an automobile built for regular gasoline. Why would you eat foods that you're not designed to eat? Whether you're filling your tank or stuffing your face, the wrong fuel can wreak havoc on the system. What should we not eat? Well, according to our paleo diet gurus, we shouldn't eat cereal grains. We shouldn't eat dairy. We shouldn't eat highly processed and refined carbohydrates. Instead, we should get our carbohydrates from non-starchy fruits and vegetables. We should get our proteins from grass-fed cows and things like this. Well, I'm not a dietitian, and I can't speak with any authority on the nutritional costs and benefits of either of these two diet types, but I can talk about their evolutionary underpinnings. When people ask me what the diet is, what the diet was of our ancestors, so they can sort of plan their menus for today, I ask them, what ancestor are you talking about? Our lineage has been a work in progress for millions of years, and diets have changed over that time. Not only that, but remember the biospheric buffet? The diet of any single one of these species probably differed depending upon where the individual lived. Populations living in the open savanna clearly ate different foods than those that lived in the forests lining the rivers or on the lake margin, on the lake shore. And perhaps that's the real answer here. Perhaps the real answer is that we've evolved for versatility. And that's what should be celebrated. That perhaps is why we managed to take over the world, to find something to eat no matter where we live, no matter where we've moved. The fact that we can live up in the high Arctic is simply because recent peoples have taken almost all they eat is marine mammals and fish. The fact that we can live on the equator, well, the people who live on the equator get 70% of their calories from sugary melons and starchy roots. Perhaps that's what we should celebrate. And we should celebrate teeth because it's our teeth that have allowed us this degree of versatility. That's pretty much all I have to say. I hope you enjoyed it. And if anybody's got any questions, I would be happy to take them. I'd like to thank Hope Amison and the Museum of Culture and the Environment at Central Washington University for the kind invitation for me to speak, as well as museum curators, my colleagues, and funding agencies. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ungar. So now I wanted to see if there are some questions. I know that for some of us, this may be, quite new, quite novel kinds of things, but at the same time, I think that there are some of us who, I'm looking at you, Pat Levinsky, and then Lords as well, who probably study some of this already. So I want to open it up for questions now. Pat.
So my question for you originally was going to be about functional morphology, but without ever using those words, you went all around all kinds of the topic and sort of explaining all the complexities there. And this is a term that not everybody in this audience even knows anyway, but I'm a zooarchaeologist. I've spent many years looking at certain teeth like pronghorn antelope teeth. I looked at probably more than most people. But I do a lot of outreach stuff too. And one of the funnest things to do with outreach when you have a bunch of skulls is to show people the skulls and talk about what their diet might be on the basis of, what the molar structure is and stuff like that with little kids. And one of the things that's always in the back of my head sometimes is, well, I'm sort of pretending like the functional morphology is 100% here and not really bringing up all the complexities that you just spent a whole lecture describing in more detail as on your quest to figure out the sort of dietary history of hominids. So for people like me or Lords in this audience where, some of those things are things we talk about and are talking about human evolution and but you have some really neat, data sets that I wasn't really aware that there was quite that much richness to some of the microwear data and that sort of stuff. So I'm not sure I have so much as a question as just a comment about how you kind of pulled all these things together in kind of a neat way. And I just thought that was interesting, and maybe we'll talk more after the question part's over.
Thank you. Yeah, until fairly recently, this concept of food prints wasn't really out there. And microwear is just one of the types, right? A lot of people look at isotopes, which are basically the chemical composition of the teeth as determined by the foods that were eaten when the teeth were growing and developing. Others can actually look at the remains of foods on the teeth. Phytoliths, for those of you who are sort of archaeologically minded, for example, or even sometimes the tartar on the teeth preserves DNA from the animals that were eaten, going back to Neanderthals. So there are a variety of these different food prints, and it's a really different way of thinking about fossil diets than is functional morphology. Functional morphology, the relationship between the shape of a structure and its function, what it does, well, that's really more about what a species has evolved to eat, has evolved to do, what it is capable of doing, not what it really does on a day-to-day basis. And sort of the recognition, and I kind of came to this when I was in the rainforest in Sumatra. I spent a year chasing orangutans and monkeys around the rainforest. And my first month, I was watching macaques and leaf monkeys. Macaques are supposed to eat fruits, but for the first couple of weeks, they eat nothing but leaves that I studied them. And for the first couple of weeks, my leaf eaters ate nothing but fruits. And it was so frustrating. I was ready to go home because they weren't doing what the textbooks said they were supposed to do. I guess they hadn't read those textbooks. But I sort of came to appreciate the fact that animals don't always do what their teeth tell them they should do, right? And that's true of all of anatomy. Look at the goats that climb trees in Morocco, for example. And if you don't believe me, Google it. It's quite remarkable that animals don't always listen to their anatomy. So we have to look for other clues to behavior.
Pete, I'm really curious, what are your thoughts on thinking about our current moment facing climate change and how this might actually show up in our diets and the diets of other animals, other mammals? What is there any kind of conversation like that going on within people who are looking at teeth?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's actually my main research focus now. I kind of finished on the hominids. The main focus of my research is climate change ecology at the moment. And not talking so much about people, because people are going to eat whatever they grow, right? We've got this wonderful global network of food, so we're kind of buffered from a lot of it. But I've been working a lot in the Arctic, right? And the Arctic's warming at more than twice the average, the rate of the average for the planet. And that's having a dramatic effect on the foods that are available to the endemic animals of the Arctic, both the herbivores that eat the plants that are changing, and the carnivores that eat the herbivores that are changing and moving around. And so you can't actually go out over the course of, say, 50 years and watch rodents and Arctic foxes and reindeer eat as glaciers melt and sea ice retreats. But what you can do is you can look at their teeth, right? You can look at the teeth of reindeer that are accumulated in butchery shops. You can look at the teeth of foxes that have been collected in museums over the past 100 years and actually relate the microwear, relate stress lines associated with malnutrition to specific climactic events. And sort of that's definitely a direction that we're moving in. And we've borrowed from paleoanthropology and paleontology these tools that are much easier to handle than actually going out and trying to watch animals eat across the entire Arctic.
Thank you for that. Are there other questions?
Well, as a follow-up for that, so could you give us like a little tidbit of maybe something you have found in this more recent research that's that you just find interesting or compelling or intriguing for the future?
If you'd like, I hadn't planned on doing this, but I might. Let me show one slide. Is that okay, Hope? Do we have a moment?
Hope says yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. Let me grab a slide up here from some of this research. I'll give you an image of. Give you an Arctic fox. Let's see. Okay. I'm going to give you I'll give you an image from an Arctic fox. I gave a talk at a workshop on Svalbard. I don't know if any of you know where Svalbard is about 2 months ago. No, actually at the end of August. Yeah, a couple of months ago. Svalbard is actually located, it's the northernmost human settlement on the planet. It's in the high Arctic. Let's see here. And can you see this?
Yes.
All right. So much of my research has until February focused in Russia. in northern Siberia, a place called the Yamal Peninsula, which is in western Siberia. And basically, this has to do, this is called the Yamal Peninsula, and the southern part of the peninsula is low Arctic tundra. The northern part of the peninsula is high Arctic tundra. And one thing that's really interesting about that is that in southern Yamal, there are rodents available year-round. And when those rodents aren't available, in southern Yamal, there are medium-sized herbivores. These are called ptarmigans and these are called hares. And in northern Yamal, there are no ptarmigans or hares. And so while the Arctic foxes in the south fall back when there's not a lot of rodents available, fall back on these sort of softer, medium-sized herbivores, those in the north of Yamal seem to be limited to carcasses of reindeer, which contain very hard bones. They scavenge the hard bones. And so what's interesting is when you look at the teeth of rodents, of Arctic foxes from the northern part of Yamal, and we sectioned these canines, and it tells us that the ages of these two individuals are the same. Those in the north have much more worn teeth than those in the south, which is consistent with having to crunch down on bones. Likewise, when you look at the microwear, you see during rodent-rich years, when everybody gets rodents, it's pretty scratchy, which is what you'd expect of soft, tough meat eating. But during rodent-poor years in the north, when they're forced to eat bone, you get pits. In the south, it looks just like it does during rodent-rich years. That is, softer foods like these ptarmigans and hares. And if you don't believe just the pictures, here are the measures of complexity. There's much more variability in how complex the microwear is in the north in years when there aren't a lot of rodents. But in the south, it looks the same as during rodent peak years, which is not a lot of complexity. So what's really kind of interesting here is that the microwear can help us get a sense of how animals are handling sort of changes in climate and changes in resource availability differently in different places. So that was, I think, probably the neatest example. And you can't see that just looking at the gross wear of the teeth, because gross wear is cumulative. It accumulates over the course of the lifetime, right? So you look at a 5-year-old fox, it's going to have really worn teeth in the north, whether in that particular year it was eating soft foods or hard foods. But the microwear, which reflects only a few days to weeks, that can help you separate out sort of whether it's a good year or a bad year. So together you can get more information with the gross wear and the microwear than you can from either of the two alone.
That's really fascinating.
And
Really?
yeah, I just presented that a couple months ago.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
Sure.
Are there other questions? All right. Well, I don't want to hold you any longer. I know it's 2 hours later there, a whopping 8:32 in the evening. But thank you so very much for this, Dr. Ungar. We really appreciate you doing this. And I have to say, it's been my foray into teeth has been made much more enjoyable thanks to you. Even though, I never took a class from you. I really do kind of wish I had at this point. Not sure how it would have fit into my research on tourism, but I could have made it work. Who knew?
Well, there are teeth in Eureka Springs.
There are teeth in Eureka Springs. There's teeth in a lot of places. So if everybody could join me in a lovely send off here. Thank you. Yeah, just we'll keep in touch and let me know, that you're getting, my email. I'll be probably sending you some emails and things like that. And additionally, tell everyone back in Fayetteville that I say hello and that I miss them dearly.
Absolutely. Thank you again so much for the kind invitation, and thanks everybody for spending your Thursday evening with us.
All right.